Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSat Network. Friend, today we are going to discuss new social movement. What is new social movement? Because before distinguishing between old and new social movement, we will try to know what is social movement, and we'll see how it has emerged in India in the context, background, and also we'll talk about the possibility and prospect what it have for the development. And for discussion on this great topic, we have in the studio Dr. Satish Jha. He teaches political science in Delhi University and has a specialization in political theory. So I think his knowledge and experience and how he interprets using the theory of the movement will help us to understand the new social movement and will also give a new insight to understanding the movement going on. So on behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for EduSat lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. In fact, today's discussion on new social movements is quite, topical as well as quite significant for understanding the social and political process in India. Because what we are witnessing today is proliferation of number of activities in society which have been called movements, and they are normally called social movements. I mean, social movements in the sense that most of them have originated within society with the obvious purpose to bring about significant changes in social, mostly social, but also the political life of the people. Now, to begin with, when we talk of social movement, normally we mean by social movement those actions which are collective. At the same time, all collective actions do not qualify to be called social movements, but only those actions, collective actions, normally are called movement, which have certain characteristics. Characteristics like they have some sort of ideological orientation in terms of what they want to attain, what they want to change, and what they want to gain through those actions. Number two, it is also believed that those actions have to have some organizational framework, network. Unless there is an organizational network behind these collective actions, they cannot be called movement, because you have all different types of collective action. For example, right is also a collective action, but we don't call a right or such action, such acts which are of course collective, but we don't call them movement. So some sort of organizational network apart from ideology, because organizational network and ideology provide a kind of a perspective, a kind of a vision, a kind of a framework through which collective actions get their meanings. So basically, in fact, all collective actions do not qualify to be called social movements. Only some of them enter that qualification, enter that characterization. Now, coming to the third characteristic of social movement, apart from the ideology and organization, is leadership. Now, leadership is also very important factor. Of course, not necessarily the leadership in traditional sense, the way we understand leadership, that every movement is to have a leader, at its top, but some sort of leadership, understanding of leadership is also important in social movement, because ultimately it is through the leader that certain objectives are sought to be realized, and an organization and ideology are to be networked and are to be fused together. So leadership's role is also considered to be important. But the most important factor in a social movement is, or any movement for that matter, is the element of objective goal. Unless these actions have goals before it, what they want to do, and it is here that ideology plays important role. I think unless there is a goal, element of target, objective, goal, I think that no action, whether it is collective or not, can be called a movement. So I think these characteristics, these elements are important for understanding any collective action which is qualified, or which is basically qualifies itself to be called social movement. But apart from these four elements, there are 2-3 important things which we should remember. That as we have seen, that all collective actions cannot be called movement. Only some of them can be called a movement. Number 2, that these collective actions normally originate in society among people with a purpose. The purposive act, there is a purpose behind it, and purpose normally is change for better. I mean, in terms of qualitative change. I mean, they seek to transform, they seek to change society qualitatively, not only in terms of quantity but also quality. And therefore, this change oriented nature of such action is very important. Therefore, sometimes these movements are categorized as different types of movements. A reformist movement, radical movement, a status quoist movement, a reactionary movement, progressive movement. There are various types of movement depending on the nature of change which they try to bring about within society. If it is meant to bring about a progressive change, a qualitative change, a change which is basically targeted towards the structural aspect of the society, if it is a structural change, then it is normally called a radical movement. If it is simply trying to change or trying to reform certain things, then sometimes they are called reformist social movement. So all these things are there when we try to discuss this issue called social movement in India, social movement as a whole, and also in India. Now, this new social movement is a term which becomes interesting. Why it is new? And what is the difference between new and the old? Because there is nothing called old social movement, but social movements and the new social movements. Now in India, normally it is believed that the 80s, late 80s, we have had the proliferation of such collective actions around number of issues which were traditionally ignored, and therefore around these issues some actions materialized, and those resulted into a new set of politics, the politics which has been called as a new social movement. Now in fact there is also debate on this issue, that in periodization, that when should we consider the beginning of this new social movement. There is one school which believes that new social movement in India can be traced back to the post-emergency period. I mean, when the emergency was lifted in India, that is 77 onwards, we have had number of such instances where the traditional understanding of power, traditional understanding of social processes and many other things changed, and people realized the limitation of political movements centered around electoral politics, and therefore I think that new alternatives were searched, and out of that, you had this whole host of new actions called new social movements. But there is another, you know, school, another opinion. I mean, there are a set of scholars who believe that it is not post-emergency period, but rather it is, 80s, particularly late 80s, that we can trace the origin of new social movements in India. Now, I am reminded of one special issue of a journal called Seminar, which was in fact brought out in 89, and it was devoted to this issue of new social movements. And that was the time it was believed that issues like farmers movement, women's movement, green movement, ecology movement, and movements around science, issues like science and technology, alternative technology, and many other issues were emerging, which people felt that this traditional understanding of politics or the traditional mode of politics would not be enough to deal with these challenges, and therefore a new generation of political activists, new genre of politics in fact emerged within civil society, and that in fact was a new social movement in India. Now, this new social movement, sometimes people also try to compare and contrast with the similar thing happening in the Western world, the new social movements. But here, in fact, before I move further, I would like to point out that while making this comparison, one should also remember there is a marked difference between what has happened in the West and what is happening today in India in name of new social movements. In fact, I will come to this issue later, that what are the major differences between the two processes, or in fact the two variants of this politics. But one thing normally which we see, that whenever this new social movement is discussed, people believe that in the West, in the similar way, a new mode of political action has started, a new mode of politics has started, and that has certain characteristics, and therefore they have been called new social movements because the issues which they have raised were not raised earlier, either in the mainstream political movements or the social movements understood in the traditional sense, and therefore they thought that it was the beginning of a new phase, and it was called new social movement in the West. But apart from the occurrence of these movements, there was also a theoretical or ideological churning going on within the West in the name of postmodernism, because it was believed that the Western society had entered a new phase of development, that was a post-industrial society, and therefore some of the visions, some of the processes which characterize this modern period in the West associated with this phenomenon called modernity. I think it was believed that they have run their course, and they are now showing their limitations, they are showing their problems, and therefore they needed to be interrogated. And the new social movements in fact emerged essentially or primarily to interrogate those processes which emerged in the West, largely due to this modernist project. So therefore, new social movement had a theoretical ideological underpinning in the West, mostly coming from a new theoretical development that is called postmodernism, both in literature, in social science, and in many spheres of intellectual life. So what has happened, that the new social movement normally has been understood in the West through the lenses provided by this ideological framework called postmodernism. Now, postmodernism has number of theoretical positions on number of issues, but the most important issues which it tried to problematize was the question of the relationship between a state and the civil society, and number 2, the nature of politics. And therefore, this entire question of micropolitics, local level politics, or the politics around the issues which pertain to local, not universal, particular, not universal. And then the entire state and the entire class, because non-class characteristic of this movement. It was believed that this post-industrial, post-modern period is characterized by a situation where the class issues are not the only issues through which oppression, subjugation, discrimination and domination are materializing in society. Therefore, certain new categories have to be invented, and certain new categories have to be brought into the discussion. And therefore, the politics also has to organize itself around the new issues, which necessarily has to be the non-class issues, whether it is gender, identity, or for that matter ecology, or the rights, not rights only in terms of economic rights, but other rights which do not have purely economic content but are valuable for human beings. So therefore, this non-class, non-state, or sometimes it is put as entire state, because state is is no longer a reference point for these movements in these discussions, but it is believed that it is a civil society discourse, because it is largely within the purview of the societal processes that these changing dimensions of power have to be understood. And therefore, this postmodernism and a new social movement, the discussion of the two have gone hand in hand in the Western social science as well as in Western society. But coming back to India, we find that there is a difference, because number one, the context is totally different. It is not the post-industrial or the post-modern situation which they believe, the Western social science believes, that is characteristic of the Western situation, is true to India. It is also not true that these social movement, new social movements which have emerged in India are purely along the same line as we have seen in the West, in terms of non-class, anti-state, and purely local or the micro focus of these activities. Because in India, the class itself is highly a complex process, class formation, and the class politics. Because of late now we have seen that how this class caste nexus is being understood in both society, politics, and the social science, that the intricate relationship, the mediations, number of mediations which basically go into making the two, the caste and the class, that is there. But apart from that, there are many issues in India which have a both class as well as non-class articulation. For example, there are issues which appear to be non-class issues, but if you look deep down, you will see that there are certain class articulations. It cannot be totally insulated from its class background, class framework. Similarly, the state, the state formation or the state process which we find in India in terms of its role towards social transformation is also different from the West. And therefore, when the new social movements in the West try to problematize this issue in terms of entire state framework, in fact that does not make much sense in Indian context, because in India what happens that the state itself is a major agency of social transformation. As a state itself is basically one agency through which the society tries to realize itself, particularly in the post-independent period, last 60 years. Of course, there are major limitations which this process has finally met with, but we'll come to it later. But the thing is that whether it is the old social movement or the new social movement, they cannot totally ignore the importance of the state and the state agencies in any viable or any discourse of alternative which is sought to be built through the mechanism of politics in society. And therefore the new social movements in India have to have a different reference point than what we have seen in context of the West. So therefore this analogy of new social movements, and particularly this comparison between the West and the India, has to be qualified adequately, because this context is totally different. Now coming to the second important aspect is that this social movement, why do we call it social movement, and what is the difference between a social movement and political movements? Now it is normally believed that the most important difference between the social movement and political movement is that political movements seek to deal with power, and power mostly which is basically available through the channel of electoral politics. Therefore they have a kind of understanding of politics which is normally traditional, which is basically legal constitutional, which is basically institutional. Whereas the social movements, whether be it old or the new, they have a different understanding of power. Sometimes it may not be institutional, it may be institutional, it may not be institutional. Number two, the entire the focus is not simply in terms of capturing power or in terms of dealing with power, but of course power may be one of its reference point, but the purpose is to bring about change in society, bring about transformation in society, bring about change in the life of the people, change in the processes within society. Therefore it is always change oriented, whereas the political movement also may try to seek change, but in fact the reference point, or one can say that the mode of bringing about the change, is totally different. I mean the mode of political movement, of mode of bringing change for a political movement would always be institutional, would always be in a democratic politics, could be electoral, and so on and so forth. But that may not be true with the social movements. Now normally, therefore it is believed that social movements most important priority is social transformation. Now how to understand this social transformation? I mean social transformation in terms of changing the existing structures of both discrimination, subordination, exclusion, and so on and so forth. So therefore the social movements are necessarily geared towards bringing about change or social transformation, and therefore they seek to, number one, interrogate the existing social order. They interrogate the existing social order. Therefore they are not normally a status quoist. They are not a status quoist because they question it. Number two, they clamor for a egalitarian social order. They simply try to bring about change which can ultimately lead to a social order which would be egalitarian, equitable, non-discriminatory. Now then at the same time they also try to reimagine many things. They try to reimagine self, they try to reimagine the group identity, they try to reimagine social processes in a new way. So I think this reimagining things also are part of this process of social transformation, which this the social movement normally tries to do, and in this case the new social movement is no exception. Then there is also a search for the new modes of political action, because it is true that democracy operates on certain established understanding of political actions. What are the actions which can be taken recourse to in any movement? And therefore, democracy both facilitates as well as puts limitations on the range of possibilities so far as this political action is concerned. But one thing is very important to remember, that what is ruled out normally in a democratic society in context of the social movement is the use of force and violence. Normally, therefore, the social movements have to find out new ways and new means to to organize collective action in a manner that it may not turn violent, it may not use force, and still try to deal with the power structures, new challenges, because always social movements have to think in terms of evolving new method of doing politics, because the challenges keep changing, and therefore because it necessarily doesn't have to operate within the framework of institutional politics, therefore it had that autonomy to reimagine and visualize alternative modes of political process. Therefore, we have seen that number of experiments have been made of doing politics around number of issues. Now, from the farmers movement to women's movement to Dalit movement, to, for example, anti-corruption movement is the most important issue today, which is perhaps the new generation of a new social movement. I mean, we have seen that how new methods of politics are being invented. Of course, there are some methods which are already part and parcel of our discourse since the time of our freedom movement. But I think that with the changes in technology, with the changes in communication, with the changes understanding, new modes have also been incorporated into the entire process. Now, therefore, I mean, with this background, that first of all, that there is a difference between social movement and political movement, then there is a difference between also the social movement, I mean, new social movement of India and the new social movement which we normally know by the same name in the Western context. Now, we have to see that, this difference between the new and the old, new social movements and the old social movement. Now, what is the difference? Because you see, in India, I mean, the social movement is not something so new, because we have seen that from since the time of our freedom movement, we have had number of powerful currents, political currents within society, and I mean, those discourses, those politics, those actions try to address both issues, both questions pertaining purely to political power as well as questions which pertain to social processes, social structures, structures of domination and subordination, structures of discrimination and exclusion. So, therefore, it is not something new that we are only today witnessing something called the social movement. But one thing is important here, that in India, when we were dealing with these issues earlier, before independence, in fact, what happened, that these movements mostly pertain to the question of redistribution and question of recognition and representation. These were the two main concerns of the movements at that time. And even the political movements at that time had to grapple with these issues. For example, Indian National Congress at that time, which spearheaded the anti-colonial movement in India, also grappled with these two issues, particularly after the advent of Gandhi on the political scene. But at the same time, there were other movements which were within the society, which didn't have the macro presence like the Indian National Congress, which didn't have that type of political vision which Indian National Congress had, but nonetheless they grappled with these issues in a big way. And therefore, what happened that after independence, some of those issues with which these social movements grappled with were incorporated within our constitutional framework as our constitutional goals or constitutional values, mostly put under the broad rubric of liberty, equality and justice. Now, therefore, what we see that after independence, what social movement tried to achieve before independence, now after independence, the state within the overall framework of constitutional governance tried to basically push forward or take this entire project forward in terms of realization of those goals. So therefore, we find that two join hands, the social and the political, in terms of the integration of these values within our constitutional vision. I mean, Indian constitutionalism, one can say. But interestingly, what happened that from 1947, we have had number of experiments and number of processes in name of nation building, in name of democratic politics, in name of institution building, in name of redistributional politics, and so on and so forth. Therefore, for number of years, we saw that there was a situation when these these currents which were there in the society earlier remained dormant for many years. For one can say that for 2-3 decades they remained totally dormant, because people thought that now it is the state which is committed to bring about these changes, and therefore they have to repose faith in it for accomplishing this task. So every individual in Indian context was looking towards the state and state's democratic project, state's nation building project, and so on and so forth, that how it is trying to involve, integrate everyone in this process, and how these goals and these objectives which were laid down would be achieved through the instrumentality of the state. But what happened that later, particularly after 60s, a kind of disenchantment, disillusionment, one can see basically taking root in the society, particularly when they discovered, the people discovered that the entire project was getting derailed. Therefore, the instances of exclusion, the discontentment on issue of redistribution, discontentment on issue of representation, or the recognition of both group identity as well as many other types of identities. When these things were noticed, then suddenly we find that again there is a quest, a surge for a new politics outside this mainstream political process, which is normally associated with the electoral politics. Now, what happened that the issues around which this alternative was sought to be created, alternative politics was sought to be searched or organized. What happened that most of the mainstream political parties were already seized of these matters. For example, every political party had a frontal organization or a wing devoted specifically to these issues, women's issues, farmers' issue. For example, every party, if you look at Indian political parties, they will have one frontal organization for farmers, peasants, working class, workers, students, women, tribals, Dalits, and so on and so forth. So basically, the mainstream political parties gave this impression that they are already seized of the matter, and therefore there is no need, the way we had earlier before independence, to have a separate movement around these issues, to bring these issues on the mainstream agenda of politics, and therefore the mainstream political parties gave this impression that they were not only seized of this matter, but they were in fact trying to find out suitable ways and means for redressal of the grievances and rectification of some of the injustices which are basically seen in the social context, and therefore all structures of discrimination and exclusions are being addressed within the mainstream political process, particularly within the framework of constitution, law, and the government. But in spite of mainstream political parties giving this impression, we find that the 60s and 70s we have had proliferation of activities, and those activities had their high point in the pre-emergency JP movement, where you had the merger of number of social activities and political activities. And when JP Jayaprakash Narayan gave the call for total revolution, it was basically amalgamation of the number of issues which had been generated in the society due to the discontentment and disillusionment with the mainstream political process. But the failure of JP movement and the subsequent experiments, particularly which resulted due to this movement, that was the Janta experiment as people call it. What happened that people realized that such experiments, if ultimately have to be rooted through the mainstream political process or electoral process, then it would ultimately lead to the same result what the Janta experiment ultimately led to. Therefore, the post-emergency period, as many people, particularly the Gail Ombet is one of the such scholar who advocates this line, that the post-emergency period we have had a new generation of politics materializing in India, and therefore it is the beginning of the new social movements. Whereas some scholar like Ramchandra Guha and others would call 80s, late 80s at the beginning of this period. So I mentioned in the very beginning that there is a debate that in terms of periodization, when to consider which period we should consider as the period when this new social movement started in India. So what happened that this post-emergency, as I mentioned, that Gail Ombet is one such advocate, particularly in her book Reinventing Revolution, she takes this position, and other places also, other papers which she has written on this issue. So post-emergency, she believes that particularly the beginning of the farmers' movement in India, particularly the Shetkari Sangathan, Sharad Joshi and others in Maharashtra, and in Karnataka and different parts of India. Now there are a number of issues which are normally dealt with while dealing with the farmers movement. I don't have the time to go into the detail. It is believed that terms of trade which became unfavorable to the agricultural sector in post-emergency period, and therefore particularly during the emergency and post-emergency period, the farmers mobilized themselves and basically they organized as a lobby and tried to seek redressal of some of their grievances, though they necessarily didn't participate in the political process, mainstream political process, but nonetheless they acted as an important pressure group. Therefore, this farmers movement, in fact, for many scholars, is one such indication that a new brand of politics started in India. Now, after this this farmers movement, there was also a Dalit movement and the women's movement. Because women's movement, normally people believe that during emergency, this towards equality report, and then the realization about the abysmal change, or one can say that the pathetic conditions or the totally non-improvement in terms of their social status of women, led to a new thinking, new realization that how to seek change, how to bring about change in their lives, what are the new ways which can be thought of. So women's movement, Dalits movement, farmers movement, all these movements one by one, people say that in post-emergency period started coming to the center stage, and therefore it is the beginning of the new era in terms of this political, in terms of this collective action called social movement. Then what is new about it? Why they have been called new social movement? That is another important issue to discuss. Now it is believed that the old social movements were purely occupied with the issues of class and at times with caste, and therefore mostly with the issues of redistribution, poverty and other similar issues. Whereas this new social movements brought new perspective on number of issues. On the issue of farmers, they raised the entire issue that it is not only the class understood in terms of the production process, I mean the kind of exploitation on the point of production, which is normal way of looking at the class and the class discrimination and class exploitation. But the farmers movement tried to problematize another issue, that it is not only on the point of production but also point of consumption or point of circulation through market, that it is not only the landowners versus landless, but it is between the countryside versus the cities, it is between the industries versus the agriculture, it is the farmers located in the villages and the industrialists located in the cities. So new kind of class disparity is taking place in India because of our economic development and the entire strategy of economic development. Therefore, a new perspective on development. Now, this new perspective on development did not simply apply to the farmers, but also many other movements which subsequently materialized in India, particularly on issues of science and technology, alternative technology. Now, what is basically role of technology in creating structures of discrimination and exclusion? How to think in terms of having alternative technology. Similarly, the question of the Dalit politics. Now, the traditional way of understanding this caste was slightly broadened within this new framework of this Dalit discourse. So was the case with the women's. I mean, traditional understanding of women's empowerment also underwent changes. So, what is normally believed that these new modes of understanding social and political process was totally different from the old understanding which characterized similar things in the past, but they were social movements mostly geared towards the traditional brand of politics. So, therefore, it is believed that the new social movements brought new understanding to our political and social process. Now, what happened, that again it is to be remembered that when they problematized this issue of class, as we have seen in the case of the farmers movement, they tried to define class in a new context, in the context of India's developmental strategy, that how farmers as a class is not part of that structure which is basically associated with exploitation and domination, but it is associated with a structure which is itself discriminated due to the terms of trade, unfavorable terms of trade. So, this class was basically reconceptualized, and here many people feel that this reconceptualization basically was done with the help of new theoretical ideas which came not only from Marx but also from Max Weber, the sociologist, for whom this market and this circulationist logic is very important for understanding class formation in society. So, therefore, this farmer movements did it. Now, similarly, the question of identity, what this women's movement and the Dalit movement tried to problematize. Now, identity in terms of difference or identity in terms of sameness, because earlier, as I mentioned, that the earlier movements when in colonial period took place around the same issues. I mean, the focus of these movements was in terms of basically seeking or achieving a social order in which there will be sameness, I mean the citizenship rights. The difference, refining difference or emphasizing difference was not the main issue. What was basically important at that time was that erasing this difference, so that a more homogeneous social situation or social order can be created. But here, instead of focusing on the erasure or erasing this difference, what was basically emphasized, that it is not simply erasing difference, but it is also important how to recognize this difference, because unless you recognize the difference, I think there are certain things which are associated with that identity will not be properly appreciated, and therefore the entire question of identity was reconceptualized, both within the women's movement as well as the Dalit movement. So, this new social movement tried to bring these issues to the center stage of political attention. Now, similarly, as I mentioned, this ecology, the science and technology, the students, the green movements, and so many other movements which we have seen over the years emerging in India have tried to reconceptualize many issues of discrimination, many issues of oppression, and many issues of exclusion in the same way. And therefore, they have not simply interrogated the state and its policies, but have also tried to interrogate some of the social processes which are responsible for these things. Therefore, what I mentioned in the very beginning, that when we compare these new social movements with the new with the Western counterpart with the same name, new social movement, we have to be little bit careful, because as we have seen in the case of West, number one, they are normally non-class in the entire state. In Indian context, we have seen that all these movements which are normally called new social movements, the class issues as well as the state policies are central feature of these movements. They cannot simply ignore the state power. And because whether it is a farmers movement or the Dalit movement or the women's movement or the science and technology movement, one can see that state is the important reference point. For that matter, even today, when in last few months or a year, one can see another variant of this politics which has surfaced here in name of anti-corruption movement. Now, anti-corruption movement one can also call as part of this larger discourse of the new social movement, because this anti-corruption movement also seeks to bring number of issues to the political center stage, and at the same time also seeks to transform, not only simply is targeting the institutional change, but tries to bring about a larger issues within broad rubric of this discourse called anti-corruption movement in society. Now, here also the state is an important reference point. Therefore, in Indian context, the new social movements have to have a important element of a statist ideology. I mean, whether you try to seek change within the ambit of a state, or you simply try to bring about changes within society, but nonetheless one has to refer to the state policies. That cannot be ignored, as we have seen in the case of the West. Similarly, the class dimension, because every issue has a class underpinning, and therefore the class dimension can also not be ignored in the Indian context. Now, coming to the next issue, after this understanding this difference between the new and the old, that why these movements have been called new, one thing is important, that is, what is this ideological you know, underpinning of this movement, because there is no single meta narrative of these movements around which the entire process can be understood. For example, many of these movements are Gandhian in their orientation. They broadly swear by the name of Gandhian ideology. There are movements which are, you know, in terms of their leaning as a radical and left, mostly drawing on the ideas of Marx. Some of these movements are basically relying on the theoretical and ideological resources of Ambedkar. Some of these movements are hybrid in nature, not necessarily relying on one, but trying to bring ideas from 2-3 different ideological streams and then try to create their own utopia. I mean, the kind of imaginary, or kind of the way they are imagining the future society and politics, they are basically drawing on the resources from different traditions. So therefore it is very difficult to basically put them or any one of them within one ideological framework, because there are number of ideas coming from different sources which are becoming valuable for their political action. Now, before I touch this issue of this ideological issues pertaining to these movements, we should also remember that these movements in India, these new social movements, to some extent one can say is not totally new, though we call them new because we have to differentiate them from the old, but they are not totally new because they, in one sense, one can say is a continuation of the larger historical process which started more than 100 or 150 years ago in India. And those processes, when they were incorporated within the democratic politics spearheaded by the state, when they failed to deliver, then I think that again these movements have resurfaced. Therefore, one can see them as a continuation of an emancipatory discourse which started in India much before independence, that 1947. And that emancipatory discourse now basically coming to their own in terms of having their separate identity. I mean, these movements having separate identity and not being part of the larger process which at one point of time was sought to be done through constitution, through law, and through the state machinery. So therefore this is a continuation of that emancipatory discourse, and therefore what we find today, that this emancipatory discourse in India is basically relying on the three important traditions which have dealt with this emancipation. And those three traditions, as I mentioned, the Gandhian, Marxian, and the Ambedkarite. Now the question is that how to have a text of emancipation for these new social movement. But every movement needs a text, ideological text, through which utopia can be realized or utopia can be regenerated, recreated. And therefore what kind of text they can work with. And it is here that it is significant that these movements are now trying to have a dialogue with all these traditions. Now this dialogue with these traditions sometimes is also looked at as a difficult task, because some of these traditions are believed to be antagonistic to each other, and therefore it is believed that for these new social movements, even if they try to reconcile the irreconcilable, I think it will be not feasible in politics to basically translate those visions, those goals which these three ideological streams try to achieve through different mode of politics. But at the same time, one should also remember that this establishing a dialogue is always part of the political process, because politics and the dialogue are two variables through which democracy survives. And therefore, within a democratic context, I think these new social movements are perhaps best suited to establish this new tradition of dialogue. Within these three traditions which we have mentioned, that most of the new social movements are trying to draw the resources from, whether it is the Marxian, the Gandhian, or the Ambedkarite traditions, whether it is the farmers movement, or the Dalit movement, or women's movement, or the science and technology movement, or for that matter the anti-corruption movement today. So I think that this dialogue and creation of this text, because ultimately what would be the text for Indian emancipation is the moot question today. And who will author this text? Now it is normally when the new text of emancipation is created, the text is normally created by individual, but normally text originates in a context, and particularly the social situation which facilitates the creation of that text. So today's context, one can say that at this crucial juncture when India is facing number of challenges both in politics and in society as well as in economy, I think that these new social movements are best placed to create this new text of emancipation, where not only the resources from these three recognizable and visible traditions are drawn, but also resources from their own experiences in terms of dealing with the challenges which are coming today in India, perhaps which these three ideological traditions did not encounter 100 years ago, but today I think they are part and parcel of our political and social life. So therefore these new social movements, when they try to create this new text of emancipation, I think they should also remember that it is always through the interrogation of the established tradition in politics that a new should be created. So I think that this is perhaps the silver lining, this is perhaps the ray of hope, that these new social movements do not ultimately turn into another instance of a collective action which normally slips into oblivion in due course of time. Rather they provide something tangible for both society and politics, through which a future can be chalked out.
So what is the final goal of a new social movement, and what is the further of it? How can it sustain?
That is important. In fact, so far as the goal is concerned, as we have seen, the goal is basically social transformation. Now, social transformation, when we say, then social transformation itself is a highly loaded term. A social transformation of what? Because when we talk of social, that includes economic, cultural, political, and number of issues. But one thing which we should remember, that these social movements that way are highly micro issues movement. Okay. I mean one issue, one theme movement, one can say that, because they are organized around one issues, and therefore ultimately it is in terms of the networking of these movements, because when they talk of social transformation has to have a holistic perspective.
But that is true, but given the history of social movement in India, we find that all social movement exhausted when its goal is not a political, or in course of time it does not take color of politics, so it gets exhausted. So in this perspective, or in this context, do you see any future of the social movement in India?
It's a very interesting question, because this is one of the dilemmas which normally people find with reference to such movements, which on the one hand ignore the mainstream political process and power, and at the same time try to deal with them. Now it is believed that in democratic politics the normal threat is of co-option and marginalization. Okay. That either you join them, if you join them then you will be co-opted, your identity as a non-political formation will be lost. If you ignore it, then you will be marginalized. Okay. Some of the groups we have seen are very vibrant groups, but ignore the mainstream political process for long, and ultimately they are marginalized. So how these social movements show their their imagination in terms of dealing with this political space, so where they are not marginalized, as well as they are not co-opted.
So
So
can
that
we
is the test.
can we conclude like this that social movement in India is in nascent stage and still will have time to take it a concrete shape?
Oh yes, definitely, and it is in process of evolution, a
Okay.
transition. But I think that with the coming, you know, I mean the growing challenges, we can perhaps think in terms of having more and more such processes and such movements, because the limitation of the mainstream politics
Okay.
is coming in a big way before us, and therefore I think this have started offering a new ray of hope,
Okay.
right? So
So well, friends, there are galore of problem and challenges before social movement, but still there is a ray of hope, as Dr. Satish said. So we can understand that so far the social movement has identified their process, or you can say what can lead from here. So and where have to go. So this is what we can say at this stage. They have at least identified and will certainly take certain shape in coming days. So with this word, we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Satish Jha for giving such an insightful lecture on new social movement. Thank you very much.